there's a lot of ancestral trauma of losing our meaning, basically, and being told you can't do that anymore. So what's not talked about is usually the shamans working with Amanita muscaria were women. So when you ingest the Amanita, it can be hard on the kidneys and liver, but you can collect your pee after and give it to someone. So the shaman would come and eat the Amanita muscaria, take all the kind of physical problems that can come from it, and then give the gift of their pee, allegedly.
Hello, sweet friends. Welcome back to Unbroken Chain. I'm Maura James, and this is episode 27 with Kathryn Solie, who is one of the most beautiful people I've spent time with. She goes by Persephone's Path on Instagram. You'll find out why in this conversation, but I definitely encourage you to find her there. She is a really beautiful teacher. She works with plants, and this week she's going to talk specifically about her work with poison plants. I had the privilege of going to one of her classes. She teaches 8-week courses about herbalism and poison plants and their dark, beautiful magic. And I went to one of her classes in Greenpoint, and it was so wonderful in that she's a great educator and she has wonderful stories about the personalities of different plants and their specific offering of relationship to us. But she also makes it so clear that these plants are inviting us all to have direct relationship with them. And she has some really concrete tools for how to do that. For the last year or so, I've kind of been seeking that relationship myself. I currently live on a farm in Georgia in order to be able to do just that. But I think when I started this journey, I really didn't understand. I thought there was some kind of witchcraft involved in talking to plants, which, don't get me wrong, there definitely is. But the magic of that is really rooted in meditation and quiet and spaciousness and opening yourself to the messages that are so clear. And a few weeks ago, I was in Florida. I had communed with cannabis, which I have to say for me is a very clear helper spirit for connecting to other plants. In the same way, in the jungle in Peru, they say that tobacco taught the shamans how to find ayahuasca. By communing with tobacco, they learned how to put together the two plants, chacruna and ayahuasca, that make the ayahuasca brew. With cannabis in my heart, we were driving through the pine trees, and I just burst out laughing because it just suddenly was so clear to me how loudly these trees were talking to me. Looking at them, they each say so much with the way that they hold themselves, the way that they move. And we jumped out of the car and we were walking down to the river, and suddenly this bright pink flower just yelled to me from the side of the path, and I stopped and I talked to it for a minute and was like, hello, who are you? And it very clearly was like, don't touch me, but enjoy me because I'm fucking beautiful. It kind of had this sort of princess spirit almost, saying, I'm powerful and I'm beautiful and I know it and I will share with you, but stay right where you are. And when I went home, I posted a picture of it on Instagram, and several people very quickly told me that it was mountain laurel. And when I looked it up, of course, it's poisonous. Pretty much every single part of the plant is a very big no-no for human consumption. And I just was so grateful for that moment of understanding that plants everywhere are talking to us. The communication is already flowing. And as far as I can tell, it's really our responsibility to start listening and to be receptive to them and the messages that they might have to teach us. So Kathryn today has some of my favorite stories that I've ever heard about just those kind of situations and the characters that these flowers and plants have presented to her. I strongly recommend you check out her course offerings. She has a new round of courses coming up, and she's also a tarot card reader and just a very intuitive, tapped-in person who is really good at reading people and also at helping you channel those qualities within yourself if that's something that you're interested in. She came over to my place in Brooklyn a few months ago, and we had a beautiful conversation about poison plants and their specific form of medicine. And interestingly as well, a bit of a cross-section in her life between Buddhism and psychedelics. And she actually gave me a book that she wrote and illustrated that you have to go find. It is so beautiful. And I just wanted to read a little passage from it so you have a sense of the spirit that you're about to commune with. This is from the introduction. By putting enlightenment somewhere in the future, you're missing what is right in front of you. It doesn't have to be so hard. It can be as easy as noticing your breath, the scent of a flower, the passing clouds above your head, the eyes of a friend, or truly feeling an emotional response without trying to figure it out. She's such a beautiful, calming, grounding, expansive spirit, and I know you're really going to enjoy this hang. Kathryn Solie, come hang out with us.
All the work that I do comes from, ideally, a lens of non-dual and bringing in the wisdom of the poisonous plants, which is not just having a light and love relationship to spirituality, but also having darkness and pain, and that they're equally important.
What is non-dual?
Like, we're all the same, essentially. There's not a difference. Like, there's nothing outside of self. It kind of feels interesting to even talk about non-duality just starting out, because that's like the world that I came from when not my childhood, but from when I was like 18 till a couple years ago when I started working more with herbalism. But that kind of training like totally colors the way that I work with herbalism. But it's not something I talk about much anymore because I've been doing so much work with herbalism and more like quote unquote witchy kind of stuff. Moved away from Eastern spirituality more into witchy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have a background in Buddhism.
Yes. I went to Naropa University, which is a Buddhist university. It was founded by a Tibetan monk in the 70s. But I studied with a teacher named Robert Blond I still talk to him a lot, but since I was 18, and I don't think he would describe himself as Buddhist, but I studied kind of metaphysics and mysticism and Kriya Yoga with him.
Wow. And do you feel like that goes hand in hand with the plant world that you're part of now?
For me, it does. I think I don't see that happening that much, but I'm really grateful that I've had this training in meditation and doing kind of inner journeying work without taking any psychedelics. Like, that was also working with Robert. I don't think he's ever taken any psychedelics, and he's like the most awake person I've ever known. I'm glad that I have that training, and I have found psychedelics to be really helpful for myself and for others, but I didn't do them for many years.
So were psychedelics kind of a doorway into plants in general?
When I was a little kid, I was talking to plants all the time.
Really?
Yeah. I think most kids do it, especially when they're left on their own in nature. And luckily I had, even though my parents are more like, or at least when I was growing up, like atheist, material, reductionistic kind of thinking, my mom didn't discourage it. She was like, oh, that's cute. Kathryn's talking to plants, and kind of like let me do it without judgment. And then when I was a teenager, I lost it like in my early teen years, but then I started smoking pot when I was a teenager and remembered, oh yeah, I can talk to trees, and reopened that gate for me. And then that was kind of the talking to plants and plant spirits was kind of the gateway into spirituality for me. That was like, it's so funny. I went into this metaphysical like witchcraft store the other day, and I saw this book, and it was like the first metaphysical book I ever bought, and I feel kind of embarrassed to even name it, but it was called Fairycraft, and it was, I can't remember exactly what it was about, but it was like, I think a mix of like fairies and like magic stuff, and that was kind of what drew me in. But then when I started studying with Robert, there was like a refocusing on like not on the probably what he would call like the glamorous side of things, and more a chop wood, carry water type of consciousness.
Oh, I like that. I've never heard it described that way before.
That's a Zen saying: before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water.
Wow. Yeah, I'm so glad you're saying that, because I think, I mean, here I am with a podcast where I like to talk to people about spirituality, but there's definitely this instinct in discovering the magic of the world again, which I think is essentially what spirituality is. There's kind of this instinct to like proselytize about it instantly.
Yes.
And
that's how you know when someone is really new to the path. It's like, let me tell you what I know. Yeah.
That's really humbling to just take it back to just doing and being.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful that I had that training, because I think it kept me away from, because I lived in Boulder, Colorado, and there's like a lot of, how do I say this nicely, like a lot of not good
Plastic shamans.
Yes, yeah. Some that seem really dangerous to me, and some that are just kind of superficially dangerous. Meaning like they actually take you away from remembering who you are instead of bringing you to who you are. And then there's also just abusive kind of people too. But yeah, I think that really like minimal kind of approach helped protect me from all of that. And now that I'm kind of re-entering into the thing that really brought me into it in the first place, I feel like I have this kind of clean slate where I'm not worshiping the plants as deities. I'm still seeing the plants as parts of myself, like even the spirits are not outside of self.
So what is your relationship to poisonous plants now?
I want to tell the story of how I was brought into working with them.
Oh, please.
If that's okay.
Please.
Yeah. So I studied herbalism in Vermont with Sage Maura of the Gaia School of Healing, and I was attracted to that school because it's all like plant spirit medicine based. And our first weekend at school, her school is also her home, and she has this like big beautiful land with so many medicinal plants growing on it. It's amazing. And she invited us to go find a plant that is calling out to us and go sit with it. And when she was talking, we were kind of near her shade garden where there's this hellebore growing. And I didn't know what hellebore was then. And I could feel this hellebore like screaming at me, like, come over here, come over here. And it got to the point where it's almost like that feeling of being in elementary school or something and it's playtime and you want to like get to the toy that you want to play with before anyone else. Like I felt like this extreme urgency, like I have to get to this plant before anybody else goes to this plant. I was so worried I wasn't going to be able to sit with it, but no one else was interested, of course. And I sat with it, and hellebore there's different varieties of it. It's also called Christmas rose. It kind of blooms in cold weather. But its flowers point downwards, and it usually has, no matter what color the flowers are, there's this kind of like blue, foggy kind of tint to even the green leaves and everything. And yeah, this kind of drooping down, pointing downwards. And I sat with it, and I kept getting these images of being pulled headfirst down into the plant and into the roots and down into the earth and into the space where there was just this big empty void. Not that big, but it was a dark void. And down there was this naked old woman, this kind of crone archetype, and she was just laughing, and in between like laughing and dancing, she would say, "This is where you're going to do your work." And I would kind of come out of it and then be like, okay, well, that was interesting. Like, what else do you have to tell me? I didn't really want to hear that. And then I just kept getting this image of being pulled down into this dark space like, this is where you're going to do your work. So that was my first weekend at herb school. And then kind of from then on out, I only wanted to learn about poisonous plants, and that's not a part of the course there. So I did my final project on it, and yeah, it's just like expanded from there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so this is really hard to talk about in language, I realize. So if this isn't resonant, like, no pressure. But when you say that you experience the plant in that way, is it coming in as a vision?
That's how I experience it. Everyone experiences it in different ways. Like, some people will hear words, and some people will get body sensations or see colors, and I see images. I see images, and then I kind of translate them into English.
Is there usually, like you saw the crone, is there usually a human embodiment connected to plant spirit?
It depends. Like, belladonna, aka deadly nightshade, which is one of the plants that I work with, is just I can feel just talking about them, I get like kind of love struck. But she always appears to me, well, not always, but usually as kind of this very sensual, seductive woman. And what's been so amazing to me since I started teaching and leading journeys with these plants is that like 70% of people get this really similar image of a woman dancing alone in the dark in a field or in a forest at night, and usually not very interested in talking to us. She's like the only kind of plant spirit that I found that is not that interested. Like, you have to work hard to get her love. But then other plants, like henbane is another poisonous plant. Like, a lot of the plants, I kind of use gender pronouns. A lot of them appear as feminine to me, but henbane feels non-gendered. A lot of the students agree, or people that I've had working with henbane, that there's not really a gender to henbane, and it's not really humanoid. I just get a lot of images with henbane. Yeah.
So with poison plants in particular, what is the message of a plant being poisonous? Is that saying stay away?
That's a good question, the stay away piece. I think it's more, I need to be treated with respect. It's like boundaries. The poison is a boundary. So, like, for example, poison ivy, a lot of times it grows in places that the soil needs or the land needs to be helped in some way. It's like protecting the landscape. But poison as medicine in general, I just see it as like on a plant spirit level, on a more symbolic level. Again, like that light and love thing, these plants kind of hold both, but they are more heavy on the darker side of things. And when I say darker, I don't mean it's bad. I don't have a negative connotation with it. It's just we all have what I call underworlds. We all have this place in our psyche where we hold traumas and shadows and events that have happened that we don't want to think about, parts of ourselves that we don't like or that feel unsafe or uncomfortable. And if we're not integrating those parts of ourselves, then we're missing half of the picture of being human.
So experiencing these plants is kind of an invitation into confronting those repressed parts.
Yes, yeah. I find that they kind of show us what's there, and they can help facilitate processing to a certain extent. It's not like taking ayahuasca where you go into it and on the other side it's processed. Like you don't have that same kind of, it's not so intense. I really don't recommend ingesting them ever. Never ingest them. I'm talking directly into the mic now. Don't ever ingest poisonous plants. However, I have heard stories of people using Datura in a way kind of similar to ayahuasca, where you have a trauma kind of memory come up and then you throw up and feel better at the end.
So how do you work with them?
Well, mostly on a plant spirit level, and that's what I spend a lot of time teaching about, is how to do that. Well, I guess how to do it isn't really that hard. It's just the practice and being able to set aside the thinking mind that says this isn't real, or the thinking mind that has an agenda that wants to say. It's funny because I read tarot cards, and sometimes it's like you'll get a spread where someone's asking about someone that they want to be in a relationship with, and they're explaining it to me, and it's like a very toxic relationship, what I'm hearing, but I'm being non-biased and I'm pulling the cards, and they're all these, like the Tower and, you know, all these stereotypical not good cards, well, quote, not good, but cards that would indicate don't be in a relationship with this person, probably, or that this is just going to be pain for you. And then the person will be like, well, maybe this means that they're going to help me transform myself and become a better person. Like, we have really strong minds that condition us to want to just hear what we want to hear, which is why, like, more heavy-duty psychedelics, I keep doing air quotes, no one can see them, but things like psilocybin or LSD or ayahuasca, where you have no choice.
Right.
Those are really important. And if you don't have experience with checking or being able to tell the difference between intuition and thinking mind, then working with these plants, it's a practice. But I find that they will pretty quickly let you know if you're not using them properly, especially if you're messing with ingestion. They'll let you know not to do that.
So you're working with them in meditation and then also topically?
Yes, yeah. So I emphasize the plant spirit part, and we work with essences, flower essences, which is just a vibrational medicine. You're not actually ingesting any plant material, but flower essences are really powerful. I've had amazing experiences with them. And then also topical ointments are relatively safe. I would say they're very safe as long as you're not going overboard and you're not putting it in your mouth or on your mucous membranes. And when you do the topical ointment, that's when you get more into the feelings of what you might say is more psychedelic, but I hesitate to use that word with these plants. But you get into more of what I would say is a journey space or a consciousness shifted kind of space. But you have to be able to hold it yourself.
What do you mean by that?
Like with the stronger kind of consciousness shifting plants, they will hold the space for you. And with these kind of plants, with like Datura and henbane and belladonna and whatnot, it's a partnership. It's still a partnership with other medicines, definitely. I don't know. It's hard to say. It's hard. It gets into this kind of murky area here.
It's so hard to talk about shifts in consciousness in language.
Yeah. And plant spirits are hard to talk about too. And like talking about them isn't hard, but talking about what they do and how they work, I find to be kind of difficult. Hard for me to grab onto anything concrete often.
Well, I'm curious then if, since this kind of work has been in your life, if there have been significant changes that you've experienced in your own life.
Yeah. I'll also say that experience with hellebore at my herb school, when it said this is where you'll do your work, that happened like right when Saturn was making its first pass over me during my Saturn return. So it was a really intense year, and I felt that having the support of those plants in my life really helped. And I keep finding that I can go into deeper and deeper spaces with them, like surprisingly deeper spaces. And I've seen a lot of major shifts in my life since starting to work with them. I was on this trajectory, and anyway, and the plants are a support. But I don't know if I would have been able to make as many shifts or gone as deeply without their support, without the constant reminder.
Do they have intention for you or for humans?
Yeah, I think so. I think that they want us to know that no matter how scary or bad things have been, that you have the ability, you have the power to go into that and to heal. And they want to be supportive of that. They want to like show us where the places are that need healing. And
Which can be scary.
Yes, yeah. And sometimes, especially with plants like henbane, I'm giggling to myself thinking about whenever I do a henbane journey. Well, whenever, say, I do a belladonna journey, everyone's like, oh, that was amazing. This is belladonna's the seductive woman. Everyone feels like, oh, that was so good, and I feel great. And then henbane people are like, whoa, that was really intense. Because henbane is the lowest in tropane alkaloids of these plants, so they have the least kind of physical impact, but I think that they're the strongest in terms of psychological impact. They can be for most people because they often bring up a lot of images of death and blood and dead bodies and things that are really scary to a lot of people.
Yeah. What is the offering then? It's to be able to look at those things and learn how to not be reactive to them?
Yeah, or just that it's okay, that it's okay, that this is a part of life, that death is a part of life, and we've really gotten really far away from that in our culture. And that not just physical death, but death of the self, of different parts of self that we have to let go of, identities that we've built up over time, that, again, things that look really scary, traumas or shadows, that it's okay, that we all have it. Like if you're born, you have trauma, so you're not alone. There's nothing wrong with you. And when I think about this message specifically, I think about Datura, because Datura was the plant that I was the most afraid of, because there's so many stories of people taking Datura, and these are deliriants, so they confuse you into thinking things are real, and then you don't remember what happened if you misuse them, if you take too high of a dose. So there's so many stories of people basically blacking out for a week and then waking up and they've like smeared their poop all over their house walls and have no idea what happened. And I'm super sensitive and super like sensitive to everything, but plants also especially. So I was like, I'm probably never going to work with Datura. That's not the plant for me, but that's been the plant that's called to me the most. And the same thing with Amanita muscaria. I was like, I don't want to work with that. And those two, Datura and Amanita muscaria, have been the ones that called to me the most. Anyway, Datura, the message that I feel from her is she holds such a beautiful balance of this light upper chakra, kind of almost angelic feeling kind of energy, and that death and darkness, whereas henbane is more all in the death and darkness, and Datura has this really beautiful balance. And especially lately I've been processing my own stuff, and a lot of times I can feel her spirit right there with me, and she shows up as this kind of grandmother, and I get this image of her just wrapping me up in her shawl, this really loving grandmother energy. And I've had quite a few experiences where she takes me somewhere in my consciousness and I'm like, what is this? And she'll say something like, well, I'm just showing you that this is here. You're not gonna do this yet. You're not ready to do this work yet, but this is here, and I'm showing you that this is here.
Wow.
And then like a couple weeks later in a therapy session, it'll come up. And then later I'll be like, oh, that's the thing that Datura showed me. Yeah.
So it sounds like the relationship that you have with these plants goes hand in hand with your other practices. Do you meditate still? What would you suggest for people who are curious about poison plants in particular?
Getting a flower essence is probably, or just an essence, is probably the best way to start. And if you don't have access to essences, first, they're easy to make. Anyone can make them. Just Google it. It's quite simple. Or you can just call to the plant spirit if you're in a meditation, laying down or sitting in a quiet space. Meditate for 10 or 20 minutes to get the mind slowed down. And then welcome in the plant spirit into your consciousness. Basically, however that looks for you. It's kind of a feeling that I get. You could actually say, welcome, Datura, welcome into the space. And how can I work with you? What messages do you have for me? And when they're approached with respect and reverence, I find that they're all really wonderful allies, really ready and willing to work with us when approached with the intention of trying to get high or trying to get something or something for an ego identity. Not helpful. They won't be as helpful. They can be kind of wrathful. Not kind of wrathful. They can definitely be wrathful.
I'll spank you a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. I always talk about Datura as the sweet grandmother energy, but every once in a while I get this split second of this like wrathful face. It's saying, don't forget, don't forget. And another way to work with it that is relatively safe is with topical ointments. Yeah.
I'd love to ask you about Amanita muscaria a little bit, because I have a relationship with psilocybin, but that mushroom has always been, I think, kind of in our collective psyche. It has this particular mythos to it, but certainly in my life, I've always felt like reverential and kind of like a step away from it. So what is that? What is that creature?
Just thinking about it, it also brings into mind, I feel like part of the draw to these plants is I'm of European descent, and most of these plants are of European descent, or they have some ties to European ancestry as well. And I feel good knowing that I'm using the medicine of my ancestors, and in a time where there's so much cultural appropriation. It feels like a good thing to look at what our ancestors were doing instead of looking to other cultures. And with that, it can be difficult because the European shamanic lineages are all broken. We don't have direct lineages anymore. We're just kind of putting together pieces. Amanita is one that it's not super broken.
What was the original context in which it was used? Or original, I mean, what is that lineage?
Well, so actually, a lot of the images that we get about Santa Claus and Christmas come from Amanita muscaria. Or this is at least a theory that a lot of people say is legitimate, that Santa was either a shaman, because the shamans working with these mushrooms would wear red and white robes, or that Santa himself was an Amanita mushroom. A lot of reindeer eat Amanita muscaria, and think of Rudolph with the red nose. And one of the effects of ingesting these mushrooms is that you get a sensation of flying. So flying reindeer.
Oh my gosh, you're blowing my mind right now.
And they often grow under pine trees. And people would forage them and hang them to dry onto the trees. Another way people would dry them is to hang them over the fireplace, like we do with stockings. So the shaman Santa would go from door to door, and what's not talked about is usually the shamans working with Amanita muscaria were women. Usually they still say, oh, Santa's a man, but it was usually women. So when you ingest the Amanita, it can be hard on the kidneys and liver, but you can collect your pee after and give it to someone. So the shaman would come and eat the Amanita muscaria, take all the kind of physical problems that can come from it, and then give the gift of their pee, allegedly. Or the mushrooms themselves might have been gifts. Also,
so when you drink the urine, you're getting the medicinal effects, but without the nausea. And the,
yes, exactly. Wow. And people still will collect reindeer urine and drink it for the same reason. Also, one more thing is that sometimes the snow would be piled so high that the shamans would have to enter in through the chimneys. So just like literally every aspect of Santa Claus comes from this psychedelic
minus the
practice.
Materialism and
yeah, exactly. We've gotten really, really off course there. I'm forgetting what your original question was.
I mean, you're answering it exactly. I just wanted to learn more about that mushroom, and because it's not psilocybin.
Yeah, it's not. In my experience, it's very different. You do get visions, but it feels similar to being like really drunk or something. Not with the cloudiness of mind, but kind of your motor skills are really slowed down and everything is really slowed down. It's not quite the same. But I've read a lot about people taking it, like micro amounts of it, for healing Lyme disease, for working with depression. Yeah.
So what happened to these lineages and the shamanic containers that originally protected these?
Christianity. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think all of us of European descent have, also going back to cultural appropriation, I feel like we're so, like, as white people, so desperate for meaning in our culture and so lacking that in our history that it makes sense that we're looking to other cultures that are intact, and as long as it's done respectfully, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But with that, I think there's a lot of ancestral trauma of losing our meaning, basically, and being told you can't do that anymore.
And by that you mean praying? And
yeah, praying, working with the indigenous deities of wherever you were, working with plant medicines. So another fun holiday thing is that witches flying on broomsticks. We get this image from, so the Ointments, one of their names or something that they go by is flying ointments. And there's some folklore that women would rub broomsticks with the ointments and then ride them, either inserting them vaginally or like riding on them. And these also give you the sensation of flying, similar to the Amanita muscaria. So that's where we get witches flying on broomsticks, that they would actually use these plants to fly to the witches' Sabbath and go dance with the devil. And
oh, you're giving me goosebumps. It just makes me so, I mean, there's so much sadness that's been stripped away.
Yeah.
But it makes so much sense. It just explains so much.
Yeah, and it's hard too with, for example, with the witch's flying ointment, because the lineage is so broken and lost that the only records that we have of witches flying ointments come from the witch trials, from court records where, you know, they were basically forcing under torture mostly women to say this is what they were doing. And they would say the ointments were made with the fat of Christian children and just all kinds of, you know. But yeah, those of us of European descent all hold that trauma, whether our ancestors were a part of the witch trials or not. That was a general consciousness for our ancestors at one time, and it still is a reality in some parts of the world that you can be killed for being accused of being a witch.
If I'm connecting the dots, is it accurate to say that the shamanic roots for people of European descent is or was held by women?
I don't know. It's hard to know. I know with the Amanita muscaria that would be the case, but I'm sure that there, in that culture, there would have been male shamans doing. Yeah, there's actually, this makes me think of another serendipitous kind of occurrence. This is more on a personal level, though. When I was working a lot with henbane at one time, I started to have these dreams where I had a staff, a big staff, and in the dreams, I was using them in different ways, usually as a weapon to stop someone who was hurting myself or my loved ones. And in one of the dreams, there was this man who was kidnapping me and my friends, and at some point in the dream we escaped, and he found that we escaped, so we were all running away, and I was trying so hard to hide so that he wouldn't see me. And then he saw me, and I was like, oh no, I have nowhere to go, I can't do anything. And all of a sudden I looked over and I was holding a staff, and I was like, what is this? And one of my friends was like, oh, that's your staff. And I was like, what? I don't know how to use this. And they were like, yeah, you know how to use it. And then I remembered, oh yeah, I know how to use this. And then I knocked his head off with the staff. But after having all those dreams, this was for a couple weeks, I started to look out for, I'm going to find my staff. Like, I know that I'm going to find this somewhere, and I eventually did in a park. But then right around that time, too, I read Witches and Pagans by Max Dashew, which is about European shamanism from, I don't know, from the 1300s to the 1600s or something. But there's a whole a whole chapter on Norse shamans, which were called vulvas. I might be slightly, my Norse is not very good, but it literally means staff woman. And there are these burial sites in Norway where they had women who were shamans, they could tell by what they were buried with staffs, and they had bags of henbane seeds with them.
Wow.
Yeah, and mostly women, because it means staff women, but they also found men buried like that too. So I guess I've mostly studied women's lineages in shamanism because it's overlooked a lot. And when I was more into Buddhism and that world, I was studying the feminine deities because they get overlooked. There's a Buddhist deity, Tara, who's goddess of compassion, and her origin story was that she was a princess who attained enlightenment, basically, and she said that I vow to continue to incarnate into a woman's body because that serve the aims of men are many, but those who are serving the aims of women are few. Yeah.
It feels like part of what was threatening about women healers, or witches, if we're going to call them that, is, I mean, obviously, like any signal that's pointing you back to yourself rather than to authority is going to be a threat to the system, if that's Christianity or patriarchy. But it seems also like it's tied to sexuality.
Yeah. So another thing about the nightshade plants, which the poisonous ones, nightshade's a huge family that includes potatoes and bell pepper and tomatoes and tobacco. But the poisonous ones are, well, the ones that I work with are belladonna, datura, brugmansia, henbane, and mandrake. But there are also aphrodisiacs.
Really?
Yeah, like, yes, very much so. So if you can imagine, these clergymen were probably very upset by plants that not only helped you commune with quote unquote God by yourself without the use of church, but also turned you on at the same time. And that would be something I could imagine they would want to stop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so interesting that I mean, I guess it's not that surprising at all when considering kind of the cycle of death and rebirth, but it's so interesting that a death plant is also so tied to sex.
It's been a really interesting awakening for me to see that tie. The first time that I journeyed with henbane, I got images of that I was having sex on top of piles of dead bodies. Wow. And that was kind of intense, but also the feminine deities that I had previously worked with a lot were the wrathful ones like Kali, and Chinnamasta is this goddess who cuts off her own head and uses the blood to feed her devotees.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
So I was kind of used to seeing stuff like that, but it was still, and usually the wrathful deities are standing on top of people who are having sex. Yeah.
Is that kind of a collapsing of time? And I don't know, maybe I don't even have a complete thought. I'm just trying to understand what the message of that is, I guess.
Oh, yeah, collapsing of time. That's, when you first saw that, I was like, what? And sitting with that for a second, that there's no separation between death and sex. There's no separation between pain and pleasure. It's all the same thing. It's just a different flavor, a different perspective of it. Yeah.
Where do these things have place in our modern culture, our modern Western, very entrenched, materialistic, paternalistic culture?
I like to see them as just allies, as helpers on our path. When you're working with a flower essence, it's something you can take every day. You can take as much of it as you want, and you can feel these kind of subtle changes, these subtle sense of being brought back into the body. They're very embodying, I find, which is, I think, a big part of also why I'm drawn to them, because I'm so sensitive and so open in the upper chakras, and I have a harder time with grounding. And these plants really bring you into your body, and I think that they bring you into your body because that's where trauma is stored, or it's just a lucky coincidence. But I think flower essences are, again, just a great way for people to use it day to day. I use the ointments maybe once a month for like a new moon kind of ritual. If you don't want to have a full-on psychedelic journey, it can be just kind of like a help, like an aid on the path. I don't want to say one is better than the other, or they're just different, and you can do really deep work just on a plant spirit level. Every plant serves a purpose at its own time. I'd like to see people using them to work through psychological stuff. psychological stuff. That's a weird way to say it, but to work through shadows, to work through the underworld, the personal underworld, in conjunction with therapy and practices that help them remember who they really are.
Which I guess is sort of the condition that comes from having shamanic practices stripped from us culturally, is that we end up with all of this trauma that we don't know how to move, basically.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, a sense of coming back to the self, of coming back to what's really important, that remembrance that we're gonna die and we can't take this stuff with us, and being able to kind of like see through the veils and be able to navigate the things that we're afraid of.
It seems like you use myth also in tandem to remember those lessons.
Yeah, the Persephone myth is primarily, that's my main jam. I love the Persephone myth. It's, I think, a really, in the most simplified terms, a really wonderful analogy for the processes that we're going through every day, where there are times in our life where we are realizing not everyone's going to know the Persephone myth.
Maybe would you give a little...
Yeah, it's... So the Persephone myth, it's a Greek myth, and Persephone is the daughter of Zeus, who is kind of the all-father god, and Demeter, who's the goddess of harvest, plant life. And so Persephone is their daughter, and Persephone, her role is she's the goddess of flowers. She goes about and brings flowers into being. So I like to imagine her with a little paint pot tied to her waist, and she goes about in the fields and paints little stripes and polka dots on the flowers and paints new flowers into being. And one day, as she's walking through the fields doing her duties, painting these flowers, she sees on the edge of this field, which we know the edges are where it all really happens, she sees this flower that she really perceives as being very ugly. There's something wrong with this flower. She doesn't like it. Its colors are very dark. It looks like maybe there's even blood dripping off of it. So she decides to go over to it and pull it out of the ground. And when she goes to pull it out of the ground, when she first grabs onto it, she gets pricked by its thorns. And she doesn't let this deter her. She goes back and readjusts her grip, and she keeps pulling and pulling, trying to pull it up, but it's very stubborn. It's like if you've ever tried to pull tree roots out of your garden or something. It's that really deep root. She can't really quite seem to get it. And eventually she does get it. It pops out of the ground, and she lands on her back. And as soon as it comes out of the ground, everything around her starts to shake. The ground is shaking gently at first, and the hole where she pulled it out starts to grow with the shaking, and it keeps growing, and the ground keeps shaking more and more, and she's looking over into this hole that she's created, and out pops Hades, the god of the underworld. And he's in his black robes and his black chariot. It's pulled by horses the color of ghosts, and he grabs her, he snatches her up and pulls her down into the underworld, and the earth closes up so quickly. This happens so quickly that she can barely get a scream out. Demeter and Persephone are very close. They have a very close mother-daughter relationship. And so when Persephone doesn't come back home, Demeter is very worried, very distraught, and she starts to go look for her, wandering the fields, asking everyone that she sees, have you seen Persephone? Have you seen Persephone? And no one's seen Persephone, and there's no sign of her. Eventually she comes to the field where Persephone was taken, and she spots Persephone's little paint pot and one of her sandals. And upon seeing this, she knows something is really wrong. So she goes to Zeus and says, our daughter is missing. We need to launch an investigation. We need to find out what's going on. Zeus is, however, very narcissistic. He only cares about himself. He could care less that Persephone's missing, and he just kind of shoos Demeter away. Deal with this on your own. This isn't my problem.
Thanks, Zeus.
Yeah, exactly. And he repeats that pattern, and every story about him is very narcissistic, only cares about himself. So Demeter continues looking all over the world and trying to find Persephone. And as she's looking, she's so upset and so distraught that all of the plant life dies. Her job is to keep about all the plant life. And because all the plants are dying, people are starting to die too. And they're calling out to Demeter. They're praying to her, making offerings to her, begging her to bring back the plants. And she is so upset she can't hear it. She's so focused on her grief that she can't hear the cries of her purpose. So meanwhile, Persephone is in the underworld. She doesn't want to be there. And Hades is doing his best to win Persephone over. Hades is not only the god, the ruler of the underworld, but he rules everything that's below the ground. So precious metals and jewels. So he makes for her many gifts of jewels and jewelry and robes made of woven gold and silver. And she rejects these all. He makes feasts for her every day. And she especially rejects this because she knows that anyone who is in the underworld and lets even a morsel of food pass through her lips or their lips is then bound to the underworld forever. One of the gifts that he makes her also is a shade garden with plants like hellebore and henbane and mushrooms and black orchid. You can imagine my delight. This was another synchronistic thing. I was listening to a telling of the Persephone myth early on in my poisonous plant studies, and I heard this version that he created this shade garden for her. It's very exciting.
Does shade refer to that family of poison plants?
Well, nightshade, but a shade garden is just for any plant that doesn't need a lot of sunlight. A lot of these plants don't. So meanwhile, Demeter's up on the earth, and she's completely lost herself, forgotten who she is. Her hair is all matted. She's covered in dirt, and anyone who saw her would not recognize her as a goddess. And one day she's sitting in a courtyard of some city somewhere, and this woman starts sauntering up to her. And this isn't just any woman. This is a very old goddess. Her name is Búho. And this goddess has no head. Her nipples are her eyes, and her mouth is her vulva. And she's very voluptuous. And she comes up to Demeter and can tell that Demeter's very sad. And she starts telling Demeter dirty jokes. And Demeter initially doesn't crack a smile at all, but eventually she's laughing heartily. And I don't know why this part of the story always gets me, but that laughter helped her remember who she was and what she was really doing. So from this point, she's able to refocus her energies, and she finds Hecate, who's another ancient Greek goddess. And Hecate just sees all. She knows where Persephone is, and she's able to tell Demeter where to find her. And so Demeter then again goes back to Zeus and says, okay, now I know where Persephone is. We need to send Hermes to go get her. And Zeus at this point is open to this possibility because with all the people dying and all the plants dying, no one is making offerings to him. So he doesn't like that. So he agrees. He sends Hermes down to go retrieve Persephone. And meanwhile, down in the underworld, Persephone is sitting in her shade garden. She's very forlorn, as she's been the whole time she's been there. She doesn't want to be there. And a young boy walks by her, and he's eating a pomegranate, and he offers her some seeds. And Persephone doesn't know that she's about to be rescued. And for whatever reason, in this moment, she decides to eat 6 of these seeds. And as soon as she does, she hears the familiar sound of Hermes flying sandals. And he comes down and he says, I'm here to bring you back to your mother. But you didn't eat anything, did you? She said, no. Don't worry about it. And they fly off. And pretty much as soon as they fly off, word reaches Hades that Persephone has both left and that she ate something. So he's following closely behind. And when they all get to Mount Olympus, Hades demands that Persephone come back with him because she ate food. And Demeter is the opposite. No, she has to stay here. And Zeus decides that Persephone will spend 6 months in the underworld and 6 months here on Earth with her mother. And this is where we get the idea of seasons. So those 6 months she's in the underworld, Demeter is so sad that everything dies. And when she comes back, the goddess of flowers brings about new blooms. And there's not a lot of stories about Persephone besides this that we have anymore. But we see in later stories that she seems to have really taken to her role of queen of the underworld, that she has as much power in a lot of ways as Hades does, that they have an equal kind of relationship. They're the only married goddess couple that doesn't have children. There's this kind of level of independence that she has. So I really like to see this story through a symbolic lens, to see all of the characters as just different aspects of ourselves. It's really easy when we hear the story to get lost into the who's bad and who's good. And we all have Hades within us. We all have Persephone. We all have Demeter and Zeus and Baubo and Hecate and Hermes. We all have these different archetypes in ourselves, different parts of ourselves. And I mean, Hades can just be a traumatic event that's happened. That's how it happens a lot. A trauma, it just pops up out of the earth. It seems to just engulf you so quickly you don't even know what happened. And most of the time we feel very forlorn and unaccepting of it at first. But once we can kind of take in some nourishment in this underworld place, in the darkness, we're able to find our power there. And we're able to reemerge into the springtime and know that she has to return back to the underworld, that it's a cycle. It's not like a hero's journey where that's it, you did it, you conquered it, that's the end. It's the Persephone journey, which is the human journey, that we all have times in our life where we're down into the underworld and times in our life when we're up in the springtime. And we can have multiple journeys happening all the time. Like you might be in the springtime of your relationship and then in the underworld of your career. And I feel like the poisonous plants really help support this message that it's a cycle, that sometimes we're down in there and sometimes we're up here, and one is not better than the other. Which brings me back again to kind of spiritual communities and how there's always such a focus on love and light and namaste, and it's not complete. It's not the full transmission. It's missing something. Mm-hmm. We need both.
Thank you for telling that. That's so beautiful. It's taking me back to childhood because I was fortunate to go to some pretty alternative schools when I was younger, and I grew up with a lot of stories of myth. They were stories, but I didn't necessarily take them into myself and understand that the gods and goddesses are parts of us. And I feel like you just reoriented everything so beautifully for me, like understanding even why we tell these stories.
And we all hear them. Like, that's what makes a good myth, is that they can be interpreted a million different ways. So if you even take the Persephone myth and you're not interpreting it like the way that I just explained, but you're interpreting it more on a literal level, it can be really healing for people who are survivors of rape, of incest, of narcissistic parents, of a mother-daughter relationship where there's enmeshment. There's so many things that we can find healing from on a more literal sense too. So when I teach this part of the class, the course that I teach, and we talk about the Persephone myth, I ask people to pay attention to what jumps out at you, because whatever part of the story that you're focusing on, that's probably where the medicine is for you.
So how does that go hand in hand with the herbs for you?
It's just that cycle that I can see the Datura spirit, like with her hand on my back, just being like guiding me down into the underworld. Like, this is safe. It's safe to do this work. And I hesitate slightly because I don't want anyone to re-traumatize themselves. Because if you just go into a trauma, it can just be re-traumatizing. There has to be a support system or more of a bigger picture. So I don't recommend that anyone work with these plants or work with trauma by themselves. We can do much deeper work with a support system, with even a community or someone that can hold space and knows that trauma is stored in the body. That thinking about trauma, trying to figure out the story, is not that helpful and can actually be more harmful than helpful.
Yeah, that's been huge for me, I think, in realizing how physical it is, because I've intellectually understood the mind-body connection, but it wasn't until I started working with plant spirits that could actually help me shift the energy that I, first of all, understood that energy was a real thing, and second of all, understood that those stories live inside the body, not just the mind.
Yeah. Just hearing you say that, my shoulders relaxed a little bit. It's been interesting stepping more into the role of like teaching this, because I don't get to do as much of my own work. Not that I'm not doing as much as I was before, but I'm holding space for other people more than I'm holding space for myself. So every time someone says something like that to me, like that there's these stories in our bodies, I'm like, oh yeah, I can just rest a little bit. This is my shoulder tension, is my certain story that I hold. Yeah.
Well, thank you for creating space for people and for opening up. I mean, for me, just finding you on the internet, you've sort of opened my imagination to how the magic of, like you were saying, turning off the judging part of my mind that might think that these things are, you know, not real, but to welcome in the possibility of realness in these realms, in the myth realm and the plant spirit realm, is just so nourishing and transformative. So thank you for cultivating that spirit and sharing it.
Thank you.
It's really special. Where should people find you?
I am on Instagram as Persephone's Path, and on my website, KathrynSolie.com, I do an online course that is a 6-week course, and it's all about poisonous plants. We talk about the folklore and the history and the medicinal uses of these plants, and then we journey with them. Yeah, and I do other kinds of work. You can learn about it on my website.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for hanging out with us, beautiful friends. You can, of course, always find me too, Maura James, online and on Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. I'm out in the woods with pretty much no internet. I have to drive about half an hour to connect, which has been a real gift, really humbling, and exactly where I'm supposed to be for a little while. So when I make contact with civilization, it's like taking a big hit of connection. I caught rural Georgia in a really magical time when the humidity is only at maybe 60% and the mosquitoes have not discovered that I'm here yet. So the first night I arrived here at dusk, I went outside and was sitting on the porch of the 300-year-old farmhouse where I'm living, and a nighthawk swooped down, buzzed my car, and then came and sat about 2 feet away from me. Just nestled on the ground, looked me in the eye. We stared at each other for about 2 seconds, and it flew off. And I was just so taken. I was the girl that in middle school, when everybody was giving each other spirit animals, somebody told me, "Maura, your spirit animal is human. You don't have an animal, actually." And I think there was definitely a part of myself that was offended by that and has been yearning for some kind of connection. And I just marveled at the fact that the first second that I was quiet and put myself someplace where that kind of magic could come in organically, that the universe sent such a magical sign of encouragement. And I was able to go read all about the nighthawk. They're crepuscular, which means they're active in the transition times of twilight and early dawn. And for that reason, they're known as a bridge between the spirit and human worlds. And in olden times, they were often associated with the world of the elves and the fairies, which is not the first time that someone has told me that I am part fairy. So it's been an invitation to walk the path of that magic even deeper. Go spend some time with a plant that's calling to you. Sit under a tree or a shrub, or put a flower on your kitchen table and ask it what it has to teach you. Ask for its protection and pray for its life and nourishment. There's so much magic possible. Always, always. I love you all. I feel you out there, and there are many more blazing beautiful souls to come. I'll see you out there. Be sweet to each other.